To live on social media?
Yeah.
Perfect. Over to you, Shuchi.
Okay. Are we all ready?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Some technical glitches at our end. Sorry, we are beginning just a few minutes late. But welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is the first part of our series in collaboration with the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts. And we have three wonderful panelists with us today. So as part of the Doors agency, which was founded in China in 2017 by Bérénice, Angremy, and Victoria Jonathan, two French professionals who live between Paris and Beijing. The discussion today is with Rahaab Allana, who's the curator of one of the shows that was shown at the Jimei x Arles in 2019. And the conversation today extends to their initiation of the Jimei x Arles and speaks to the place of photography in the present. Welcome everyone. Hi Rahaab, hi Bérénice and Victoria. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll just give a very, very short and quick introduction, and then I will hand over to Rahaab. Bérénice, Angremy, and Victoria have been the co-directors of the photo festival Jimei x Arles from 2017 to 2019, which was created in China by the Rencontre de Arles and Three Shadows Photography Arts Center. They have curated several exhibitions on Chinese art and photography, the stars from 1979 to 2019, pioneers of contemporary art in China, which happened in Paris in 2019, and many, many, many more exhibitions across in Arles and other places. Their agency Doors develops cultural projects between Europe and China, notably with the Picasso Museum, the Giacometti Foundation, and the Henri Cartier-Bresson Foundation. So welcome everyone. Rahaab, without wasting any time, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuchi. To begin with, I would like to thank, of course, the Chennai Photo Biennale for this collaboration, or rather for reaching out and your interest in the exhibition, but also, of course, the Jimei Arles Festival that has taken root over the last 5 years, I suppose, or around that much time. And for a lot of that time, both Bérénice and Victoria as directors of the festival. I think it's sort of also interesting that we have this sort of outlay from the Chennai Photo Biennale, which runs its own, as you know, cultural event. And as everyone's cultural events right now are somewhat in stasis, everyone is thinking about when to sort of restart programming. It is an interesting thing not only to look back, but also consider what might be avenues in the future to explore for photography as a media. And in this, I would like to, of course, thank Bérénice and Victoria for inviting me as one of the curators last year, which came on to this year, of Catalyst, the exhibition. But my understanding, of course, is that this was part of a larger invitation to more exhibitions from India, greetings from India. And I believe in the past, you all have also had Indonesia and Korea as participating countries. It'll be nice to sort of lead into that at some point of time. But I was interested, of course, in just starting this conversation with a line of sight, you could call it that, from Jimei, which is one of the 7 districts of Xiamen, but also which experienced a kind of economic opening out some time ago. And it's something interesting to think about with respect to China that has seen overwhelming, what one may see as economic progress, but also to think about the development that has taken place in a more circumspect manner, especially for cultural institutions in the country, and of course with participating countries that have collaborated as well. And of course, this draws a line to Arles, to the south of France, to the largest, one would say, photo festival in the world, as it were, that kind of celebrated 50 years And there was a kind of homage to it in the exhibition that we saw in Jimei, which was fascinating, which had to do with one of the first exhibitions, I believe, that was hosted at the festival all the way back in the 70s, in 1970, I believe. And so there was an interesting cultural mix. Bérénice, also, as you were talking just yesterday, you had already had an exposure or created an exposure for China in 2007 in Arles itself, in the photo festival. But of course, your engagements with and within China go back many, many years to the early 2000s, which I hope that, again, we can sort of lead up to in this conversation. I think one of the key points that I wanted to sort of raise as we begin talking is, of course, location, the importance of location vis-a-vis Jimei, vis-a-vis Arles, how you actually brought these two spaces that are separated by a huge amount of terrain and various time zones into one sort of entity would be really interesting for our viewers to hear about. So without any delay, Bérénice, maybe you can lead us into the festival and maybe sort of the prehistory of the festival, how all of this really began. We'd like to hear that.
First of all, thank you very much, Rahaab, and thank you naturally to the Chennai Biennale Photo Biennale. This is a real pleasure to share this kind of thought about what we did with Victoria these last years, and how we had the chance to invite Catalyst to exhibit in China, which was at that time, I think, almost a real premiere for Indian photographers to be shown in China. Not the real premiere, but almost, in a way. Maybe we will have the chance to explain that more during the conversation. Actually, you pointed right. The fact that we're talking about now a festival like the Jimei Arles, or more events, or even many photography museums that now open in China, has actually a very short history. And I think it's quite interesting to go back to what it was only a few years, or even only 15 years ago, something like this. Actually, we prepared with Victoria a little.
Let's have a look.
Let's have a look and how it works. So let me know if you see something.
Yeah, there we are.
Yes, and then.
Perfect.
I think it's better like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea was to introduce you a little bit, you know, the historical background of all this festival and of all these events related to photography in China. And my own experience actually is that when I arrived in China 18 years ago, the situation of photography and art, actually contemporary art, because my major was actually art and not only photography, was not absent, because the artists were there, but no platform, no real institutions to help to show and to display. So we came from Crash. Crash, what is it? It's like, if we talk about Beijing, there were only 3 art galleries at that time, all run by foreigners, and naturally many artists, but no space and no art spaces. For many years, the art were almost invisible, or visible in places like studios, apartments. So there was another tradition of showing artworks. And so in 2002, 2004, that was the beginning of what we call the first community in China, of artistic community. It wasn't the first community, but the first community that was public and done in a public space. And this is what I had the chance to participate to. And naturally for photography, but not only for photography, but for architecture, for dance, for performance, for sound art, it was suddenly a place that was found in the area of what we call 798. 798 is an art district that is actually abandoned factories, and that was invested by artists, and that we turned on a public space, not on private studios, but on public space. Here you can see a book on the image and the first poster of the first festival that we run in 798. Actually, this festival was really a start, I would say, in Beijing, naturally, for contemporary art practices, but also for China, because it became kind of a new model of thinking the relationship between the art, the space, and the public. So we created, let's say, a public community, and it was kind of an underground community that came out to the light. And despite authorizations, we started to have the right comments from overseas, from the medias, but also from the curators, artists. Here I will show you some photos in order to show how it was and how it looks. This kind of beautiful spaces that were invested by artists. Many acts of performances that actually became a very strong channel of photography in China, because performance and photography was linked for many years, especially from if you go back to the 90s. And so 798 Art District was the place where you could do performances. Everywhere else in China, it was kind of forbidden or censored or non-authorized. And here, even if it was non-authorized, it was tolerated. You can see a performance with done by foreigners, Kilometer Zero, and one by the artist Sangshin here. But just to give you the impression of what it was, very creative. And then at that time, so we did 4 years of this festival until the place, the city of Beijing became aware of this potential of this art district. And so they took over of the festival, and they reappropriated the festival that we were running, and they made theirs, which is also good in a way, because it makes institutional something that is on the ground. And it was a time in China where photography was also coming out in some ways, thanks to the initiative of Zhongzhong and Inri. Rahaab, you met them, who are a couple of photographers who in 2007 opened their museum, a private museum, designed by Ai Weiwei, close to 798. It was not open in 798 because Zhongzhong at that time, we looked together for a place, but then he decided to create a space and not to be in other space. And then at that time also, it was a time where the West and France and the Festival of Arles started to be very interested by Chinese photography. François Ebel was director, came many times, and invited me at that time to do the first cooperation. I mean, now he did something in 2003. It was a very big year of Chinese photography in Arles. But then it was the first time that we brought with this event in 2007 in Arles, photographers were not only photographers, but also artists, contemporary artists who use the medium of photography. And that was really something very special. Here you can see Leopoldine, an artist quite famous now.
You know, I remember this 2007 event because it was also the year we were in Arles from the Alkazi collection. And we had that small exhibition on the painted photographs on the one hand side in the Espace Van Gogh. So it was a very large year for us as well, 2007 in Arles. And of course, François Hebal was generously inviting, I think China and India were both a big part of the festival that year specifically. And of course, just to, you know, for our viewers, that François is now with the Cartier-Bresson Foundation in Paris. But please continue.
Yeah, and that was actually this time that I think for the first time, Chinese photographers who came to Arles were in direct contact with photography coming from India, or you know, And that was really something very intense, because also there were, I remember at that time, there were many conversations about the differences, but the links, etc., etc. It was quite intense moment to have this big two poles, and also for the public, I think from Arles, was like quite astonished by these two big poles, you know, of China and India. So you may remember here we have this in this exhibition. I took the liberty to not to put only photography, but I really wanted to make a point on showing that at that moment in China, many photographers or many artists devoted to the medium of photography were absolutely also invested in other practices. So I introduced, for example, these sculptures in the middle of the exhibition set. On the right hand, you can see the Olitun series of Zhongzhong and Henry, who were exhibited for the first time also at that time in this part of Europe. But then let's say that kind of photography, this kind of photography from China was shown. It was also a time where there are many kind of tests by artists here in China. What is the subject of photography? What is it? And is it only a place for, I mean, I didn't say that very clearly, but actually the show that we brought to Arles at that time was also very concentrated on the problem of demolitions. That was a big subject in China at that time. And so that was quite interesting for the public to see how it could be in a very direct way or completely indirect way, very subtle way. Actually, the Chinese artists were talking about the disasters that could appear in their own environments. Then in 2009, I was invited to show a place, an artist, his name is John Daly. And I think it's really relevant here when we talk about what is photography here in China now, to see what John Daly did in this time. It was a project that he ran from actually I put two dates because it's 2009. The John Daly exhibition was about what we call the second history. And actually it's an analysis of all these materials that are brought out of the archives. And when you can see that the manipulation of the photos made people think that something else happened, or sometimes it's not only political, sometimes it's very aesthetical, sometimes it's ethical. And it was an impression, very impressive body of works that was very interesting to show in Arles. And I think that for this show, the more traditional public of Arles Festival was actually very receptive, because they really saw something talking to themselves and related also maybe to Russian history and then photography. So this kind of subject.
I have a question, and maybe even Victoria, you can help answer this. And this is with respect to what you were talking about, publics. It strikes me that you have two very different publics that you are addressing. On the one hand, a public in China with a festival there, and on the other hand, as it were, exposing China to the world through an exhibition like the one you see in Arles, and consistently so. I wanted to ask you sort of this question about an awareness building that you are doing through the form of art, right? By exposing one culture in the other, in a sense. It's a kind of interesting intermingling. But at the same time, you have what my understanding is of the festival in Jimei, which is also state supported. Most of the work that happens in China, it seems as though it's supported also by the state, is what you mentioned. How does that work? Because what you're also trying to do is push the thematics of building community, push the thematics of a sort of liberal Western sensibility. And though it might have a willing public that looks at it, what were the challenges of doing that in a space where this is kind of recognizably constrained? there must have been ways in which, though you're creating a sort of cultural fora, the idea of culture itself is very restrained in a lot of the regions. And I also speak, of course, coming from India, New Delhi, where we've seen a kind of clamping down to such a great extent. What were sort of the strategies that you had in place? Or rather, let's ask another question. What were ways in which you were actually addressing this for a larger public that was coming to your festival? That's in China. But on the other hand, let's say the burden of having to express a cultural history, let's say, of China to a Western nation also comes with certain challenges of readability, of cultural specificity, and of context. So I just want to know, on these two polar opposite, well, maybe they're not polar opposite, but two sort of ends of the world, how are you speaking to the different publics, and what were the challenges of that?
Bérénice, do you want to go on?
Please.
So to answer the first question, maybe about exhibiting in China and the constrained context. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, so let us know, Rahaab, if I'm just pushing doors that are already open. So in China, the way it works when you organize any type of cultural event is that you have to apply for a license. So you send an application to the cultural bureau of the city that you want to organize your event in. And this not only goes for exhibitions, but also for concerts. Like, for example, foreign musicians who come to China, they have to have their lyrics translated into Chinese and submitted to the cultural bureau. This goes for films, for any type of cultural and artistic content.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get the approval, you also very often receive a visit from the chief of the cultural bureau or the chief of propaganda, usually the day of the opening or the day before the opening of an exhibition or a festival. And at that point, the chief of propaganda can decide to remove some artworks, to close some exhibitions, to close the entire event. Sometimes it has happened many times actually in China.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the basic context that you have to work with when you are in China. That
Mm-hmm.
being said, it doesn't mean that you can't show anything. And there is no precise set of rules. Usually we consider that political issues that are summed up as the treaties like Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan are censored. You can't address this directly. Of course, you can't address directly the power of social media, the censorship, the lack of freedom of expression, etc. Nudity is also now it's not forbidden. It was the case towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. Last year, we exhibited a group of artists from Xiamen, so local artists from the region of Jimei, Arles, and we showed some nude pictures that some of them took. And these pictures they couldn't show at the time when they shot in the 1980s, because they could have been not only jailed but sentenced to death.
Mm-hmm.
So we right now it's a much more liberal type of background, but this is quite a recent period still, and yes, this is basically the context that we have to deal with. So of course we have this in mind. We had this in mind for Jimei Arles every year when choosing exhibitions, which exhibitions from Arles were coming to China.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a sort of fragile equilibrium between showing first. So, like you said, the idea of the festival and the festivals that Bérénice ran before was to create a community around photography and around artistic photography, because in China, there exists 50 photography festivals, but only 4 or 5 of them are artistic photography festivals, and only 2 of them are have an international outreach, namely the Lianzhou Photo Festival and Jimei Arles. Most of the festivals are run by associations. It's called like the photographic associations, which are linked to the Communist Party. And most of the exhibitions that you see there are funded by the artists themselves. You don't really see artworks in a museum type of context. And most of the artworks that you see are sort of National Geographic photography, you know, like landscapes and like the beauty and immensity of Chinese territory, etc. So what we have tried to achieve with Jimei Arles was to really establish the festival as a platform for photographers and for artists, and hence the fact that that photography was an art form, and to sort of communicate this idea to a wider audience. And because the festival is sponsored by the government, they always have in mind, and we have to have in mind, the fact that it's attracting every year between 70 and 100,000 people. Most of them are families. Most of these families don't really have an exposure to contemporary art or photography. So you always have to keep a balance between showing edgy and challenging work, and also not be able to address a wider audience.
Yeah, I find this fascinating, because having looked at your catalogs, and I'm going to show some of them, they're kind of heavy and large for the public. This is the one that you guys gifted me when you came to New Delhi, the 2018 edition. And the other one, which I have with me, of course, is the one which was from our little expose here. What I find fascinating in these is also your interest in sort of local photography, as it were, or photography from the region surrounding maybe even Jimei. And I was particularly interested in, you know, maybe in 2018, when you were looking at the photographic societies and the work that was done post-revolution. I thought those were sort of very interesting ways of using the archive, maybe to talk about a kind of expanded cultural message. Is this something that you know, you all had an idea of doing, specifically the focus on the local to bring out ideas of self-expression, as it were?
Yes, so this was actually a request from the government from the beginning, to have to showcase local production, artistic production. And it happens that Xiamen is actually an important city in the history of contemporary art, because it's where one of the first contemporary art movements in China was created in the early 80s. It's called Xiamen Dada, in reference to the Dadaism movement. And there were, yes, in the 80s, a group of photographers who were experimenting with the medium. They are still based there. Most of them now are part of the photographic societies that I was referring to, but it doesn't mean that it's not black or white. Like, they can be part of an association of photography, a very official structure like that, and have a very artistic and creative and intellectually stimulating work. So every year we try to show older generations and also younger generations. Xiamen has also become popular these past 5 or 10 years, with young people coming from big cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, and who are tired of the pollution and being in like 20 million inhabitant cities. and it's also become a sort of hub for creative communities, mostly in fashion, but also in art and photography. And in 2019, we invited Guy Lequerec, who's a photographer, a French photographer who's a member of Magnum, who traveled to the region of Xiamen and to China many times in the 80s, like from the early to the end of the 80s. And this was also a way to show a foreign eye on the region and this decade when it all changed, basically. From a very agrarian region to a very urban one, because Xiamen was one of the first cities to benefit from the economic reforms.
Yeah, it seems like, and maybe you can sort of refer to this within an expanded scope. One of the things I found interesting while I was reading your catalog was that one of the mandates that it says it's putting out is the examination of the role of images in our society today. What I also found fascinating is the role that younger artists are playing, younger photographers or image makers rather, right now are playing with reference to the archive. And one of the works, of course, that sticks out is on the Lushan cinema that we had last year. Really, really stunning body of work. I just want you to talk a little bit about the sort of investment of a younger generation, looking back on history, looking back at these collections and creating a public absorption of them.
We can show a short clip actually of Romance in Lushan cinema.
Should we start by the clip?
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear the sound?
We can hear it a little bit. Certainly, I can hear it just a little. So even if you were talking a little bit while it was going on, it may be okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
That's much better.
It's much better. So that's the... So maybe some explanation.
So yeah, so this is an artwork by an artist called Lei. Lei is in his 30s, maybe he's 35 now. And he actually started to gain recognition about 10 years ago as an illustrator, doing animation videos. And in the, I don't know, past 5 years, he really started to focus on photography and archive image. He did many collaborations with a project called Beijing Silver Mine, which was started by a French guy who lived in China for about 15 years, and who sort of salvaged from Beijing garbages tons of negatives, constructing an archive of more than 1 million images that are all related to the argentique, to the negatives. So like basically from the early 80s to the early 2000s. So the rise of Chinese economy. And Lei and him have collaborated on either videos or recolorized photos from the silver mine. And this has really like put Lei on a new track, exploring photography and archival image. And when he won the Discovery Award at Jimei Arles in 2018, actually the media in China did not understand why he won the award. Like the biggest comment we got was, how can an artist not working with a camera, like not shuttering the clicker of the camera, how can you win the biggest award from a photography festival? And the jury was made a really strong statement by choosing him, and by commenting on his victory, by saying that he was going another direction, and that he was sort of recycling the image and providing new meaning for images instead of creating new ones. And that's also sort of what the artist says himself, that he doesn't want to add to images that are already everywhere in our society, but he rather wants to reflect on the image context that he grew up in. So in this specific video that we showed in Arles last year, he did a montage called Romance in Lushan Cinema. So Romance in Lushan is a movie that was released in China, I think, in 1981. And it was the first love movie. During the Cultural Revolution, love was sort of forbidden. So you would never see people kissing on the street. You would never read love novels or like see love movies, etc. And it was a sign of liberalism and openness to release this movie. And of course, the movie was a hit. And it's been playing non-stop since 1981 in a cinema in Lushan. So going back to your other question, it was also a case when Lei, so the winner of the Discovery Award of Jimei Arles, gets an exhibition in Arles the year after. And the years before Lei, the artist chose to show the same works that they had shown in China. But in the case of Lei, he wanted to show something different because he knew that he was addressing a different audience, not a Chinese audience. So this is something that he wanted to do personally because it was related to his childhood. He grew up in the 80s. He grew up in the region of Lushan. But he also wanted to transmit an idea of what is a young Chinese contemporary artist exhibiting in a festival like Rencontre d'Arles. He was the only Chinese artist exhibiting that year, and he created it specifically for the Arles Festival. And so for him it was maybe more accessible to a Western audience.
I think some reflection can also come from this, because as we're looking at images that are taken elsewhere and are sort of reused or repurposed, even everyday material, there's a history that you've had in actually showing archival work, even from the Archive of Modern Conflict, has been in place since 1991. I found that very interesting, as I did the other material that you've also showcased, and I wonder what its reception was, for instance, with regard to the question of surveillance and the US Army flights that were taken, these aerial views that were sort of very dynamic to look at. Yes, the one right there. And on the other hand, you're also constantly pushing the idea of form, the idea of maybe digital form, but also I think one exhibition you particularly had on people's uses of the phone, and that became a very self-reflective moment. So in a way, I wanted to ask about the dynamics of these playing out, let's say in contemporary China on the one hand, but also your role in putting these out. I mean, can you talk about it from the motivations that you all had? What were you all trying to do through this awareness building, and how far do you think it can go in generating what we might call a counter-public, a very sensitive sort of approach to this culture, then coming out in some radical form? So maybe this is a little bit about your motivations, what you saw could change from the bottom up or from the top down, because while this is happening, while you have an engagement with all kinds of archives and all kinds of thematics, I also found something quite fascinating, which is your interest in bringing also some of the great French artists, Brassai, for instance, Arles, for instance, to China as well. And I find this sort of quite an interesting exchange on the one hand, but is there a precedent to it? How did you see that fitting into the context of the Chinese public, particularly?
Actually, the Chinese public is very, very curious about everything. As Victoria said, this public is at the same time, we have to be careful because of, I mean, careful, it's not careful, but we think about it as family members, whatever, who don't have access to contemporary art or photography. But at the same time, it's a public that is actually very curious. Why? Because again, the history of photography is so short in China that it's full of experiences. It's like the discovery of the mobile phone. You know, you have your mobile phone, but actually in China you came from the public phone in the family, not even in the family, in the village where everyone was using the same phone, to the mobile phone. There was no beeper in between. You know, there was no family phone in between almost. So we come from an extreme to the other one. And I think that first there is the public that is very curious and so very attracted by the experience that you can give to it. Then the second thing is very naturally the artists themselves. The artists are also, and this is something that is quite always was fascinated in China by, is that the artists are very courageous with all kind of mediums and adventures they can take. Archives can be, digital can be another one, body can be another one. They have no limits and no, it's a little bit general to say that, but actually it's really something that we could notice from the beginning of the 20th century, how the artists and photographers were very, themselves very curious about all kind of the mediums that they could use. And they don't, for most of them, I mean, some of them that we want to show, naturally then it's a question of selection. With Victoria, when we select a project, then there is this mediation in between. But the fact that it exists in itself, and then there is the medium, the way, the sense, the aesthetic, and then the meaning of it. And naturally, the level of meanings can be numerous in China. With the archives, you can talk, for example, about your own past, your own memory, which is a very problematic issue in China, to talk about memory. So it's a way to talk about it without being completely directly into the subject. It's to talk about reusing. It's to talk about also, can be to talk about society anxieties or references. Anyway, there are all kinds of subjects that we can talk about. Then you just said, you were talking about, for example, the Shulin project that we showed 2 years ago, which is a very interesting project that is not about the artist artwork itself. The artist gesture here is to go to the US
military archive.
Military archives, and to look for photographies that have been taken during the Cold War by US Army and their collaborators on the geographical points in China. So it was very intense for this man with an engineer to find these archives and then to present them in an artistic way, let's say. But themselves, they are only archives. They don't have been manipulated more than what it is, in a way. The object exists in itself. And then when we talk about the archives that have been manipulated by Lele, for example, we enter in a completely different story, because Lele is using image, is doing animation, but actually each of his image is an image. There is no moving image. Everything is taken from his tones of photographies. So what we want to address here is the variety, but also we really want to show some intense issues. For example, this Shulin archives, for us, it's really a way to talk about a part of history that has been completely neglected, and to show that photography at that time was a tool especially in this time in China when photography was not an artistic medium, then we go back to what was the meaning of photography at that time, and how he went through the history and became at the same time a testimony of what it was done for, military prospection of the geographical ground of China, made by US militaries and Taiwanese, but and then how it becomes an object of curiosity, and then you can think about it. What was the Cold War at that time? I mean, you can think about many things when you are in front of this kind of photography.
Yeah, I like this idea because so much of the festival has to do, once again, with expanding frameworks, constantly looking at maybe the past and the present and finding ways in which we can all find entry points into it. That's what I found fascinating when I saw the array of exhibitions. I wanted to sort of highlight one other aspect which I found fascinating, which is, of course, and it drew me in from the Ukrainian work, looking at soldiers, I think by the other artist, whose name might have been Victoria. And with that respect, I mean, with respect to that work, I also wanted to bring up your interest and your sort of engagement with the Women Photographers Award. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you initiated that, and what were the sort of things that play within it?
So yeah, so when we started working with Jimei in 2017, we established two new platforms within the festival: the Women Photographers Award and the Greetings from Asia platform. So I'm just going to start with Greetings from Asia. We felt that showing, like having this Jimei Arles title and the DNA, there was sort of something missing. Like the idea was not only to be in a dialogue between the East and West, China and Europe or the US, but also to use the festival as a platform to create some sort of like multilateral dialogue. And we really wanted to show other photographic traditions or trends within Asia. So the first year we invited a collective from Indonesia called Ruang Mes 56. And they curated, they're actually a collective of artists, but they also curate their own shows. And they created quite a big show, the first year of Greetings from Asia. The second year, we invited two South Korean institutions. One is the Museum of Photography in Seoul, and one is an art and photography private project, also based in Seoul. And for them, the idea was to show three generations of South Korean photographers. Like in China, the history of photography is quite short in South Korea. So we showed basically photographers from the 1950s to nowadays. And 2019 was Greetings from India, and we invited you as a curator. And also the Museum of Art and Photography, and Nathaniel Gaskell put together a show about the colonial gaze and how it was sort of reverted by contemporary artists. So yeah, basically this is one of the platforms, and we feel that although of course like a parallel can be drawn, there are many subtleties and many differences between these different Asian creative contexts. But for example, the fact that that photography is a Western import, both in India and China. The fact that in many of these countries, photographers have to work within a constrained context. So there are also many similarities that we felt were interested to show. The Women Photographers Award, we started in 2017 because in China, women's rights are sort of regressing. Like there's always this very famous quotation from Mao Zedong, like President Mao, that women are half of the sky, and the sort of idea that the situation of women in China is better than in other countries because communism created a role for them, which is partly true. But nowadays, feminism is a bad word, like it's a censored word on social media in China. Feminist associations are censored. The Me Too movement is completely censored. So we felt that it was important to give a public forum to women artists who are addressing or not women's issues. Actually, the first winner of the award, it's the image that we can see here, Guiying Wang. She did a whole project about arranged marriages in China. In public parks, there are gatherings of parents trying to marry their kids together because their kids don't have time to date or to look for like a soulmate. So the parents go and like publish these ads. We can see one of them describing like the physical appearance of their kid, how much the kid earns a month, etc. So Guiying Wang, she did a project in a Shanghai park. And actually, she not only documented those parents, she also put herself in the position, she put herself on the market because she's considered what we call in China a leftover woman. She's 30 or 32. And because she's already past the age of 27 years old, she's considered an old woman that nobody will want to marry. And she did a performance in one of the parks by hiding a camera in the trunk of a tree and by putting her own ad describing herself very frankly and saying her age and that she was an artist. And in the exhibition, you can see a video of parents coming close to the ad and their reaction. And some of them say that she's crazy, that she shouldn't like even post an ad like this. So yeah, so this work we showed both in China and in France the year after she won the award. The second year we showed Pixie Liao. Pixie Liao, she won the award the second year, sorry. And she's been based in the US, in New York, for about 10 years. And it was the first time that she showed her work in China. And she was very surprised when we invited her, when the curator, Holly Russell, who wanted to show her work, invited her to participate in the festival, because she said that before that, every attempt that she made to show her work in China was censored. And you can see some nudity. Some images are more direct, some are not. But this is a whole series called Experimental Relationship, where she creates this mise en scène with her husband. And it's always a play on the dynamics of power in a heterosexual couple. So she always puts herself in the dominant position and her husband in the dominated position. Most of the time they are naked or half naked. And this exhibition, we were actually quite worried that it wouldn't pass the censorship. But Bérénice did a brilliant job with the chief of propaganda. And actually it worked. And it even won one of the 2 awards of the festival. And last year, you saw that work of Luo Yang, which unfortunately cannot be shown in Arles this year because the festival got cancelled because of the current situation. So Luo Yang did a series for more than 10 years called Girls, where as she was herself coming of age, she photographed girls in cities. She was traveling around in China. Most of the time, girls who are not in the mainstream, let's say, and most of the time in a very crude way. And last year we showed in Jimei Arles her new series, which is called Youth. So now Luoyang is 35 also, and she's interested in showing the younger generation who grew up in a society that doesn't have economic or political issues like the generations before, and who are also more individualistic and more sure of, more assertive of their lifestyles. And yeah, like here you can see this couple of sort of like goth rock young people from Shanghai. So she's the third winner of the Women Photographers Award.
Yeah, maybe we can sort of, thank you for that relay. Maybe we can sort of come to a sort of closure of this session. We have a couple of questions, and I think one of them follows over here. One of the attendees has asked whether a restrictive environment brings out the best also in different kinds of artists, because they have to sort of work against so many circumstances. And also the other question is from Sachdev. What is your view of old-time photographers such as Fan Ho and Sam Tata, the Indian connection? Of course, this is with respect to Bresson also. Do they still have currency today? So these are sort of some questions that we have that have come in. But to add on to those questions, one about whether restrictive environment creates, and what is the sort of perception of sort of these heritage engagements that might have happened, or traditional engagements that might have happened, is I just want to say as one of the remarks is what I found fascinating, as you just described, Bérénice and Victoria, is the constant focus you all had not only on images, but the process of making them. I think that was a big takeaway as a visitor to the exhibition that I saw. And I think it has an definite eye to a kind of representational politics that is occurring on the ground, but also with an eye to a contemporary audience that cannot get immediate access to that. And so some amount of it is mediated. The levels of mediation I thought were not overt. And so that was a real good takeaway as a visitor, is that if you allow it, there's deeper and deeper engagement that one can get into through and via the festival. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And again, coming back to these questions, does a restrictive environment also bring out creative strategies, important creative modes for us to sort of do our work, and sort of ways in which we might do it? Please.
That's a very good and very difficult question. Bérénice, I don't know if you want to answer.
But I would just say very quickly, because we talked a little bit about censorship and restriction already, but definitely I think that in China, there are many ways to address the problem of restriction in some ways. So, and you need to be creative. I mean, I can only repeat what you say, because actually, I think it became a DNA of an organizer or an artist to deal with all these ways of showing images. And image is very tough in China. Words and image, as Victoria said, they are really very controlled. Despite we have many kind of media tools now, even these media tools are actually very controlled. So definitely I think that, first of all, this is the artists who are quite creative. Thanks to them, they're never, only some of them are very direct actually. They like to play with it. Victoria?
I think it's also maybe less and less of an issue in China because the youngest generations actually don't really know that they are also growing up or creating in a constrained environment. It's really becoming more and more of a personal standpoint to be able to know what's going on outside of China. So either it's young people going to study abroad who de facto have an exposure to another type of political system and another type of information. Or it's people who want to go over the Great Firewall because in China, the internet is actually an intranet. So you can't find any sensitive information. And sometimes sensitive is like the definition of sensitive changes every day, basically. So I would say that compared to the works of artists who created in the 80s, 90s, and even 2000s, the youngest generation is focusing more on issues such as the omnipresence of the digital culture, gender, trouble, so issues that are also like more globally addressed than political issues themselves. It's a less. Vas-y.
But these issues are quite political in themselves, even if they are not directly linked to politics. They are in this society. Every issue is political in a way. If we talk about women, if we talk about gender, if we talk about homosexuality, or if we talk about problems with your landlords, it becomes political in some ways. I think that Victoria points something that is completely right, and at the same time, we are right now in a moment that is a little bit a crisis in China, and we will see how this very young generation will think about it, because despite there is no, the thematics are not the same to discuss about. The control on your tools, on your diffusing image is something that is getting really, more intense. The control is more and more intense every day. We can feel it every day. So I would say that still there is maybe a new generation that will play maybe in other ways with images and control and tactics about that we don't know. Very creatively.
Thank you, Bérénice and Victoria. That was a sort of dynamic relay into sort of an insight into the festival, into sort of community culture that is developing, and maybe your suggestion also that, solidarities of all kinds need to be developed right now. Solidarity is not a singular notion, it is a multivalent notion. And as there are so many things that play out which also feed into the cultural world, which have to do with the globalizing labor market, for instance, maybe we have to sort of take all of this into account and see how countries are represented. And of course, while we have that job of representation, either as festival directors or as curators, I guess the scenario now is to, on the one hand, yes, think of the local histories, the sort of contextual ways in which we can speak, but also to think about how we are not necessarily becoming complicit in certain ways of seeing, in certain ways of looking, and that itself, in any alternative strokes that we might create, that is maybe a space of some kind of dissent that art production and art creation and art patronage can engage with the passage of time. I'm going to end with one last question that we have from Frank Barthélemy saying, are you planning to bring Chinese photographers to India? That's the question we have for you to end this session. What's your idea there?
Oh, that would be great.
We would love to.
You should invite us.
Thank you, Bérénice and Victoria, and hi there, Suchi. I'm going to say goodbye from my end. A great thank you to the Chennai Photo Biennale, the team. I'll see you again shortly, but I leave it over to you, Suchi.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahaab, Victoria, and Bérénice for sharing so much about China and the festival, because I think many of us, while of course whatever little we get to see on the internet is one thing, but having an engaged discussion is quite another. So I hope that this conversation could possibly turn into something more meaningful going forward with the Chennai Photo Biennale as well. And we'd love to collaborate with you maybe sometime in the future, and that would be maybe in an Indian context, a Chinese, Indian, let's see, I don't know. We can see how these collaborations go on. So thank you, everyone. We're at the end of our session. And just to let you know, I'm going to request my colleague, Tejas, if you can just share the event for June 18th. We are doing our second part of this collaboration with Rahaab and a few artists from the show Catalyst that was shown at the Jimei Arles in 2019. And that's a very, very interesting show. And I think it would be great if all of you can join in for an hour or so. I know Rahaab doesn't like very long sessions, so we'll try and keep it short but engaging and meaningful. Let's try and all come together on June 18th, Thursday. That's at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. All the information is there. That's it's the title of our talk is going to be The Arc of Time. And we have Arun Vijay Mathavan, we have Lucas Burke with us. We will also have Rishi Singhal from NID, Rahaab, and the panel will be moderated by Bhuma Padmanabhan, who is one of the curators from the CPP third edition, which was kind of meant to happen this year, but it looks like it'll be difficult. But yes, do join us. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you soon.
See you.
Bye. Lovely to see you.
Yes, very soon.